Our next speaker is Dr. Laurie Perkins. And we never call her that around the office, so I did that special for her.
Wow.
Laurie is part of the staff of the Michigan History Center. Her most recent assignment has been working at the Walker Tavern historic site down by Brooklyn. And so she's going to share some things from that, but to tell you a little bit about her, the first thing you ever learn about Laurie is that she was born in Lenawee County. And just in case you didn't know, it is the most important county in Michigan.
You better believe it.
Oh, they gave her a mic besides. Jeez.
Yes, they did.
But she has written interesting things about the county, from a train wreck to the telephone company to cheese fever, which was the topic of her dissertation at Michigan State. She attended Adrian College for her BA and Notre Dame for her master's. And she's been working on rethinking how we interpret the Walker Tavern historic site. And so she's going to share some of her research from that. Jaman talked about how we have talked about abolition as a white enterprise. We've talked about all of history as a white enterprise. And we have overlooked a great deal, so the Michigan History Center, like many other places, is really putting an effort into making sure it's telling a much bigger story and a broader story. And Laurie took advantage of the pandemic to do some real digging, and that's what she's going to share with us. So, Laurie.
Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate that. And thank you to the Freedom Trail Commission and the gathering for inviting me to present this afternoon. I'm a really informal speaker, so I'm going to start from the back of the room and work to the front. So I can read the slides and point my little laser pointer. So as Sandra said, part of my duties is as site historian for the Michigan History Center. We have 12 sites located around the state. And if you haven't been to them, please come. That's our little plug there. And then one of those sites, as Sandra mentioned, is in Brooklyn, Michigan, on the border of Lenawee County and Jackson County. And it's known as Walker Tavern Historic Site. So next slide. As Sandra mentioned, I did take advantage of the COVID pandemic to work from home, and it was a wonderful experience, and it gave me time. In my job as site historian, I drive, and I turned in a car last week, and the car computer said, "You've gone 695 miles, is that correct?" I said, "Yes, and it's all on me." So I do a lot of driving, and it was nice not to have to do that. So it gave me time to do this research. As Sandra mentioned, we're rethinking our story at Walker Tavern, and we'll get into that in a moment. But this research project started out to determine the number of African Americans who were living in pre-Civil War Lenawee County. And of course, starting with Lenawee County was a no-brainer because it's my favorite place to do history. But it also, as a friend of mine, Dr. Charles Lindquist, pointed out, you need to expand this. You need to make it the whole southeast Michigan region. And I went, oh, good thing I got lots of time. So I did take a look at Monroe, Washtenaw, Jackson, and Hillsdale County, but time this afternoon does not permit us to look at all of the African Americans that were living in those counties, and there's a number of them, but we're going to concentrate on the 300 or so that were living in plain sight in Lenawee County between 1850 and 60. And we're going to only look at 4 examples out of those 300 because there's so much there to talk about, so many things yet to be discovered and written about. So I'm throwing this out there to all the historians in the room as a challenge. Pick one. Do something, because it's really a story that needs to get uncovered out there in the wider world. So I offered, again, these samples from Lenawee County, and then Any maps and illustrations that we're going to show here this afternoon are from the 1857 plat map of Lenawee County found in the Library of Congress. And it was really easy doing this from home. Got myself a subscription to Ancestry.com, which shows you full copies of census pages, so it's really easy to scroll through. And we know that censuses are not always accurate. You know, the counter, the census taker, the person revealing the knowledge. Some people didn't want to share where they were from, and so it was blank or unknown. But we have to assume they knew. We just didn't want the census taker to know. So, you know, all things are flawed, as we know as historians, and we need to do secondary work to find out collaborative things to get to the point that we're going to do. So next slide. So there's Little Walker Tavern on the left. And I'm proud of this picture. We just finished our windows, our shutters, and our new paint job. So we are all excited. The folks that have the bed and breakfast across the street who pay $500 a night can now look at us with great joy and not see peeling paint. So Walker Tavern was built in 1832. It was owned by a fellow named Calvin Snell, who sold it to a fellow by the name of Sylvester Walker, hence the name, in 1843. Walker was a native of Cooperstown, New York, and he came to Michigan, as did a lot of Yankees, New Yorkers, to start a new life and to establish a new business and to make some money. And lucky for him, bought the right place because he was on the corner of what's now M50 and US 12, which was a great place to be if you wanted to run a hotel restaurant business and a bar, basically. We would call it a tavern. He also had the Cambridge Township post office, too. Funny thing about Sylvester Walker, as was mentioned earlier, he was a Democrat, which made him a pro-slavery person. So the question is, how do we put African and Native Americans into this story? An aforementioned untold story of Walker Tavern. How do we get these folks' lives mentioned? So the big question is, are there people of African American descent, Native Americans, living in and around Walker Tavern? So that's the question. And it's an intriguing one because it's one that I had to solve. The map on the left shows you where Walker Tavern is. That little star shows you the junction of US 12 and 50, which was then the old Chicago Road, the Military Road, the Sauk Trail, however you want to describe it. And it was also, the other road was the La Plaisance Bay Pike, which came out of La Plaisance Bay, just north of Toledo, Michigan, in the, did y'all catch that? Toledo, Michigan, in the 1830s. Oh, yeah. Anyway, the lighter green shades there's like 2 shades of green. That is the valley of the River Raisin, and that shows you that it touches 5 of the counties in the region. Now, I didn't get into Wayne because that's obviously way too big, and I didn't have that much free time. So I'm going to leave Wayne to the folks who study Detroit history. But for those of us interested in southeast Michigan, it's Monroe, Lenawee, Hillsdale, Jackson, and Washtenaw counties. And so I went line by line, township by township, looking for African Americans. So we'll take a look. Next slide. So primarily because of Quaker abolitionist Laura Smith Haviland, Lenawee County is known as the center. And I say that because, I say Lenawee County is the center of the universe. Is the center for anti-slavery Underground Railroad movement in Michigan. Documenting locations, those involved, and numbers of the enslaved who passed through the area has long been a part of the county's narrative. And I remember as a little tiny campfire girl at the age of 9 being taken on the Laura Haviland Underground Railroad Trail through Lenawee County. And darn if I can remember where those sites are located now. But we went down to Tecumseh. We started at the drinking fountain at the city hall in Adrian and on. But darned if I can remember where those places are today. The primary interest of historians since the turn of the 20th century has been on those African Americans who passed through Lenawee County. We have a pass-through heritage. or so I thought. There has to be folks who stayed. And this is a picture. Laura Haviland is age 51 in the 1860 federal census. She's listed as a Negro school teacher. She's listed as a single individual. She has no other individuals living in her household. And we know she had 9 kids. She was, out and around and lived in and out, but the census names her as a 50-year-old single woman. So the reason I chose, and this is kind of my lazy way out of this, is I chose the 1850 and 60 censuses because people are named. 1840 does not name anyone. It just gives a tick mark. And so in the age of how important naming people are, hearing their name, saying their name, this is why I chose the 1850 and 60 census. I wanted to make these people live, and the only way to do that, as we know, is to say their name. Next slide. So we've done that. We've cross-referenced the county histories, the biographical sketches, noted white landowners, the military records. Some of these African Americans who stayed served in the Civil War from this area. This research project examined the lives of those who lived in Lenawee County in hopes of creating a narrative for those who made, at least for a time, Lenawee County their home. And we know that this is a snapshot because they're not passing through. They were caught by the census taker. So they had to be living somewhere in the neighborhood for a period of time that the census taker would capture their name both in 1850 and again in 1860. And it may not be in the same place or at the same time, but they've got a name and they're there, and it's not that they're passing through. So this is that 1857 map of Lenawee County, and there are all, my little pointer's not too bright, there's 20 counties. Some of these are split in half to come up with 22, but that's what Lenawee County looked like, the perfect rectangular box. So next slide. So here's what we gleaned out of looking at line by line, census by census, township by township, of the number of African Americans living in Lenawee County's 22 townships in 1850 and 1860. 1850's population is 26,372, of which 105 are African Americans. So at one point in Michigan's history, back, in the 1822, Lenawee County was the 4th populous county in the state. Of course, you have Wayne and Oakland, down. But Lenawee County had the largest population of anybody in the state. So here we are, the largest population of African Americans living in 1850 in Lenawee County is in Woodstock Township. There are 36 people. So we're going to look at Woodstock Township. We're also going to look at the trends going up, because in the city of Adrian, township of Adrian, there are 16 in 1850. By 1860, there are 125 African Americans living in the city township of Adrian. Some counties will lose, some counties will stay the same, which tells me that that person became a permanent resident. Some counties will lose, some counties or townships will gain. And this is true across the board of the other townships too. And I got all the way through the other counties, except for Ypsilanti, and the folks from Ypsilanti will hear that I'll have to forgive me, and the city of Jackson, although I did look at Jackson Prison. And there are a number of African Americans already in Jackson Prison in 1850. So that's a whole nother topic, people that are looking for topics, is what about the prison system? Because Jackson Prison is got a number of African Americans for petty larceny, for all kinds of things. But again, that's another topic. We're going to concentrate on Lenawee County. So as you're studying this, and I apologize it's so small, think about this as we go on. What are some of the things that we could be covering or should be looking at on these permanent dwellers? What are we going to find? And what's interesting is the other fact that of the counties where or the townships where no African Americans are represented, like Cambridge, like Dover, we know in both those instances that Laura Haviland had Underground Railroad captains. Fitzreed is in Cambridge Township. Martin Stockwell is in Dover Township. And these are two highly visible men who are going to support and help African Americans on the Underground Railroad to pass through, but none of them are they're not helping people to stay. Do you see that? They're not staying in Cambridge Township. And so Sylvester Walker is not an anomaly here. His whole township probably has some inklings towards pro-slavery, right? So think about what you see here, and we'll come back to that. Ogden, Deerfield, those are in what I call Blissfield. Those are the swamp townships. Literally the swamp. If you look at the plat map, they're all denoted as swamp. So not a lot of people living there anyway. So anyway, next slide. So we're going to look at 4 examples from different townships. I wish I could have gone on to other things, but we'd be here all day. So I just picked some of the ones that kind of excited me out of what I found. So Woodstock Township is located in the northwest corner of Lenawee County. It shares a border with Jackson and Hillsdale counties. There are 5 African-American families living in sections 29 and 32 during the 1850s and 60s. All either lived close to or were directly associated with the Woodstock Manual Training Institute, founded by 3 African-American brothers, Pryor, Joseph, and Levi Foster, which is a whole kettle of worms. When I got into the Fosters, found out things that I didn't even know about them, but maybe some of you do, so we're not going to talk about them. We're going to talk about folks that maybe some of us didn't know. So looking at the township of Woodstock up there in pink, you think, okay, my story is they're all white Yankee farmers, right? Everybody on that plat map is a white Yankee farmer. Wrong. Next slide. So we're going to get up close. Here is the Woodstock Manual Training School, Section 29, Woodstock Township. Here's land owned by Pryor Foster. And you'd think that all of these family names here are white Yankee farmers. They're not. I was surprised. The 2 families in Section 29 were that of Charles Claybrooks and Joseph Griggs. Between them, they farmed 80 acres over a period of 30 years. These 2 families shared work, headed each other's households, and there they are right there. Charles Claybrooks was 30 years old in 1850. He was born in Illinois in 1820. So that, doing all the math on when these folks were born and where they were born, put a new spin on who they are as individuals, too. Where did they come from? What time frame were they born in? What were the norms and nuances of being born in 1820 as an African American? According to the 1850 federal census, Claybrooks arrived in Michigan sometime around 1848, the year his daughter Mary was born. And this I found really intriguing, is because you can trace their arrival to Michigan by the births of their children. So some of them, the parent is born in Virginia, one is born in Virginia, one's born in Pennsylvania, they end up in Illinois or Ohio, they come around the corner, and then they're in Michigan. And so you think, well, the Underground Railroad is fast, it gets people through. If you're staying and you're trying to put down roots, not so fast. It's very slow. The difference in ages of the children tell you the plodding, methodical journey that these people were on to get to Michigan. And so Joseph Griggs was born in Pennsylvania in 1814. Gregg's journey to Michigan is indicated by the births of his many children. He and his wife Ellen had 5 children, the oldest of which was born in Pennsylvania, with the rest of the children being born in Michigan after 1845. All the Greeks' children had some formal education, and education mattered. It really did. It was the tide that lifted all boats. It was the thing that got you to the next stage. If you could get your kids to read and write, if you could read and write, I think it's the impetus behind the Woodstock Manual Training School. It's behind what Laura Haviland was doing at the Raisin Institute. It was trying to give an education to people, even if it was as basic as reading and writing. By 1880, the Greeks had done well on their 40-acre farm. And you can see it right there on the road next to Prior Foster. There's the road right into the Manual Training School. They had assets of over $2,000, which equates to about $54,000 in today's money. The Greeks' modest farm supported a cow, 15 head of sheep, a pig, and acreage for wheat, corn, and oats. That's a lot on 40 acres. That really is a lot. The Greeks were still active in farming some 20 years after the Woodstock Manual Training Institute closed, and some descendants of the Greeks were still owning that farm, or portion, at least 20 acres of that farm the widow was owning later on, beyond 1880. So pretty substantial thing there. So the other thing that's notable here is there is a Quaker meeting house right there in section 29, which I didn't notice until I was cutting and pasting these slides and went, oops, there's a Quaker meeting house. Next slide. So in section 32, again, we're looking down from 29. This line right here is the town section line right here. So above is 29. This is 32. So we've seen Prior Foster, and here are the bays. I never would have thought. And they're right across from the Quaker school. So first of the family was William Bays. He's 56. His wife Mary is 57, and they have 2 adult children, William 25 and Margaret 20, which is the other trend that I picked up with this. Again, they're trying to keep families together. They're trying to make a permanent home. They're gathering folks up, and adult children are staying in the household longer than probably other families would have. So they're trying to get, and it's combined labor, and it's pooling assets and resources. And so all of the family were born in New York. And the Bays owned 80 acres, and they arrived in Michigan sometime before 1850. The Bays reported $1,400, which is about $46,000 in today's money, and their assets to the local census taker in 1860. So they were there in 1850. They're still there in 1860. The second family is not so clear on this map because they fall, and how I ultimately did some of this work was if you read down the census, you look for that letter B or an M in the census, and you write down their name, and then if you can't find them on the map personally, like we did here, you go back and say, okay, who do they fall between? Whose names do they fall between? And if they fall between somebody else, who is that person, and what could be the reason and how they fell into that list? Because the census taker is methodical. He goes house by house, door by door, family by family, and he is not going randomly around the town. He's going one by one by one. So here's another family in section 32, that of Benjamin Jones, 56, born in Maryland, his wife Anna, 55, born in Kentucky. Again, Maryland and Kentucky. How these people are not next door sweethearts. They're not across the fence sweethearts from each other. How did they meet? You know, those are close states, but they're not that close. You know, so how do they get there? We know. By 1860, Jones had accumulated $210, about $6,500 in today's money, in personal assets, working as a farm laborer. And I was talking to somebody earlier this morning. I said, this is, my background is ag history. And so I look at this and I go, okay, if you're from a tobacco state like Maryland or Kentucky, or you're from South Carolina where it's rice, or maybe, you know, Mississippi, it's cotton, you come to Michigan and it's all wheat and sheep. Have you seen a sheep lately? Do you know how to cut wheat? And so you're going to have to relearn a whole new system of agricultural production in addition to this language and this being a Midwesterner. So that to me is a whole nother interesting topic that came out of this. So they have children, Mary 22 and Jacob 18, Benjamin 12. They were all born in Indiana. So now we've got Maryland, Kentucky. They've switched over to Indiana. And now the Joneses' children, they arrive in Michigan sometime in the 1850s and may have resided in the village of Addison as their names appear between the white local tradesmen. So Addison is just below the Bay's farm right here, is the village of Addison. It was part of the property owned by Addison Comstock, who's the founder of Adrian. He went up to that end of the county and he bought some land and he was going to build another city. But Addison had a mill pond, so there were millers, there were tinsmiths, there were shoe makers, cobblers, thank you, and carpenters in the 1860 census. And so the Joneses' name falls in that list. Where they actually lived, we don't know, but they could have boarded at somebody's house. They could have rented above the store. They could have done anything, but they're in this general area. So they're known by the census taker, but we can't exactly put them on a map. But we have a good idea of where they could be. Next slide. Okay, Rome Township. Rome Township is kind of on the diagonal between Woodstock and Adrian. This is section 1 of Rome Township. And the 1850 federal census reported only one African-American family living in Rome Township. And the family consisted of Sarah Boyer, 28, and her 2 children, daughter Hannah, 4, and son George, 1. Can you imagine? Yes, we can. According to the 1850 census, the entire family was born in Virginia, possibly placing Sarah in enslavement in 1822, as well as her children who were born in the late 1840s. Sarah cannot read and write. The census taker recorded her as head of her own household, but does not list an occupation. How long Sarah may have stayed in Rome Township is unclear, and there are no African Americans living in Rome Township in 1860. So for a brief moment, the census taker took a picture of Rome Township and went, there's one African American family living there, and then they're gone. That's a decade. Where did they go? Don't know. Rome Township is not too far from Cambridge Township either. The 1857 plat map of Rome Township shows that the white landowners, Russell Whitney and William Gilbert, there's Gilbert, there's Whitney, are adjoining neighbors in section 1. Sarah Boyer's name falls in the list between these 2 white farmers. So somewhere between William Gilbert and Whitney is Sarah. Somewhere. And we know from the historical record that Warren Gilbert owns 1,000 acres in Cambridge, Rome, and Adrian Township. Russell Whitney has 2 structures. There they are. 2 houses on his property. This is a main road right here, by the way. This is a main road. And Sarah could have been living in one of these houses. Maybe, don't know. Sarah may have been helped by Whitney or Gilbert during her stay in Lenawee County. Gilbert was nationally recognized leader of the abolitionist movement, and later biographies of Gilbert proudly proclaim him to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So she's in a hotbed here of abolitionists. Where is she? Somewhere here in these 2 sections. Next slide. So by the 1860, the federal census reported Lenawee County African American population had doubled. There are now 244 African Americans living in Lenawee County in 1860. Woodstock Township still retains the highest number of African Americans residing in the county's 22 townships, but the county's growing urban populations, like Adrian, Tecumseh, and Hudson, are fast becoming home to an increasing number of African Americans. As we mentioned, Adrian went from 16 to 125 in just a decade. Adrian's African American population, for example, both city and township, went from, I just said that, and most of those African Americans lived in Adrian's Ward 2, second ward, where there were 68 African American individuals and families. So next slide. We're going to look at Adrian's second ward. We're going to do some urban as well as rural things here. Adrian's second ward took up the largest section of the city's northwest corner, was the home to a growing African American population. And my very faint circle up there shows the north end, northeast corner of Adrian. This is the downtown. This is Ward 2, Ward 1. Ward 3 is the fairgrounds, and Ward 4 is Adrian College, which we know is a hotbed of abolitionist activity too, with Asa Mahan as its president and Fitch Reed on the board. Those in the second ward had skills in blacksmithing, barbering, cookery, and masonry, tended to have more assets than those who were day laborers. So, next slide. So here's a community leader, one of those folks living in the second ward. And so residing in the second ward was a Virginia-born couple, Henry Russell, 49, and his wife, Cassia, 48. Russell worked as a cook in one of Adrian's many hotels. The couple had one daughter, Harriet, 7, who was born in Kentucky. Sylvia Stokes, 73, born in Virginia, was also probably Cassia's mother. Also lived in the Russell household. The family reported $750 in assets in 1860. And as Dr. Lindquist and I were discussing this, he said the first thing you have to say that a sign of permanence is when communities develop churches. And that's true whether you're African American or whether you're white. If you can develop a church, that says you're permanent to a local community. When not working as a hotel cook, Henry Russell was busy with his many church activities. He was a founding member of the Bethel AME Church in Adrian, and the church opened its doors on August 4th, 1858, under the guidance of the Reverend George R. Clark. By 1869, the congregation had built a second church on the corner of Locust and Butler, which is where the Star is, and this congregation is still active today. So you have a 170-year tradition of African Americans church plantings in the second ward in Adrian. So next slide. The third ward, I couldn't resist. I refer to this gentleman as the late benighted, lamented Woodbury. Some of you know him as the colonel of the 4th Michigan Infantry, killed at Malvern Hill. He's buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Adrian. And nobody's ever talked in all of Woodbury's career about the African Americans he employed at the Breckett Hotel. Not once in the history that I know of Adrian. Not once did we talk about that. And he is an employer of a rather sizable number of African Americans, as were many of the hotels in Adrian. And so there's a picture of the Breckett house. When I was 4 years old, I had my baby picture taken there. They tore it down later. Before Woodbury marched off to the Civil War as colonel of the 4th Michigan Volunteer Regiment, he employed several African Americans who lived and worked at the hotel. They included A.D. Ward, 20, born in Kentucky, Virginia-born John R. Baptiste, 26, John Vine, 30, and Carolyn Conning, 20, along with 2 Michigan-born young African American men, Frank Brown, 17, and Paul Wilson, 16. And Frank Brown is one of the many number of Brown children who, there was a large family of them in the Adrian, Lenawee County area. And their names pop up in a lot of establishments in the census. But I was fascinated by this because we talk a lot about Woodbury and who he was, but not really. We haven't even looked at the other side of who he was. So next slide. This is my last example. This is Rachel and Benjaminstiktoe in Palmyra Township. Palmyra, again, we're kind of going diagonally across the rectangle of Lenawee County. Palmyra is to the southeast of Adrian Township, which is the center of the county. And Rachel Stiktoe, 80, was born in 1780 and is the only person in either the 1850 or 60 federal censuses of Lenawee County to say that she was born in Africa. And that's true. I have not gotten in again to everything in Ypsilanti and everything in Jackson, but nowhere else in the census in those 5 counties have I seen Africa as a place of birth. And the woman is 80 years old. So she was brought to this country before there was a country. And so what does that say? What does that say when you look at that? Yeah, that's true. So she was the only person. Her son, Benjaminstiktoe, was born in South Carolina in 1808, no doubt enslaved as well. It is unknown if Rachel had other children. We don't know. I don't know much about Rachel. But I was so intrigued by the fact that she told the census taker she was born in Africa. Recorded as an individual household in the 1860 federal census, the Stiktoers were living between the farms of Laurentus Calkins and the widow Sarah Dewey. No doubt Benjamin worked for one of these or both of these white families, and Calkins was a Scotch Quaker. Next slide. So somewhere between Sarah Dewey's farm here and Laurentus Calkins, right there, somewhere, is 80-year-old Rachel Stiktoe. And neither farmer had bought their property into full production according to the non-population ag census of 1860. Basic commodities grown on these farms owned by white Yankee farmers were wheat, corn, and rye, some hogs and sheep, which were typical of all their neighbors. This is the only African-American people living in Palmyra, and if you look at that map, you would never see them, except for the census. So next slide. So here are the conclusions. Next slide. We did find out that there were no African Americans living permanently in Cambridge Township in or around Walker Tavern. Surprise. So we're going to have to go some to create that narrative and pull in that larger story to Walker Tavern. We got to make those voices heard, but they're not close by. We're going to have to go further out to other townships, to other places around Cambridge Township. That African Americans lived and worked in Lenawee County during the pre-Civil War period, as well as passed through on the Underground Railroad. We have to acknowledge both sides of that equation. That the part of the African American community residing in Lenawee County doubled during this decade of 1850 to 1860. That Woodstock Township was a popular location, not Laura Haviland's Raisin Institute. I was surprised. I'm thinking, Laura's a magnet. She's getting all these folks in and around. John White, all of those folks. But the population in Raisin Township is only a few people. The bulk of them are in Woodstock, which is the next township over from Cambridge. Gonna have to look at that. Why did that happen? Next slide. The families that at the time it took many of the enslaved to reach Michigan was witnessed by the birth of their children and who and where they were married. That the family mattered. It was witnessed by the number of adult children and multi-generations that lived in various households. That African Americans working as farm laborers learned new methods of agricultural production as they transitioned from tobacco, rice, and hog cultures to wheat, corn, and sheep. That education mattered. Those with skills maintained a higher standard of living. By using their skills in labor, African Americans contributed to the growth of Lenawee County's urban areas, and that patterns of living and working developed by African Americans in Lenawee County repeated themselves across all 5 counties in southeast Michigan between 1850 and 60. Next slide. Where could these case studies in these 5 counties take us? I'm going to open the questions. Linda's sitting on the end of her seat. Yes, ma'am. Ask my boss. No, it is not currently online. It's in my laptop in my head. But it would be a good thing, right? There you go. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt. No, just little old me in a lounge chair for 18 months. Yes, this is a pen and ink operation, or quill and ink, I should say. Yes, Miss Dr. Finkbein.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, kind of expanding this out from one county into 5 counties. People like Annalisa Cox and hosts of other folks have written about how ubiquitous these more rural African American settlements were across the antebellum Midwest. And one of the points that she and other people posit, and you linked to as well, when you had this aha moment about the Woodstock
Yeah.
Manual Training Institute, and then the Quakers right beneath it, is the various folks have used the term sponsored settlements for these, in the sense that African Americans stayed in areas they thought they were safe.
Yes.
Thought they had friends with a little bit of power,
Yes.
which means whites in many cases and white Quakers in many of those cases. But I think what you are showing and what I am showing in another part of my book, with the Wyandotte sponsoring Negrotown, Ohio, you showing the Quakers and free blacks, like the Foster family,
Mm-hmm.
essentially sponsoring African American settlers in the vicinity of the Woodstock Institute, is that we can't just credit the Quakers. We've got to credit that free blacks, Native
Yes.
Americans, and a host of different faith classes,
Yes.
name it, racial groups are involved in this process.
Yep. No, it's true. It's true. Yes.
I think one thing that you might find is if you go to the next census after this, that you'll be able to track some of these people a little
Yes.
bit, which is really helpful. Also, Darius Comstock was very, very involved in the Underground Railroad.
Yes.
So it's no surprise that there were a lot of people settling around him. And I think it's possible that Laura Haviland was not really around much in the 1860, because I know that she went up to Canada to teach. So it's possible the reason that we don't have numbers in that census around her is that maybe even the people that had lived on her farm, she wasn't there anymore, had moved into the city where there were jobs. And
No, that's true. And I also think that she tried to disperse people, as you point out in your book, and especially with John White, that she is intentionally placing people. She's not trying to build communities. She's not trying to build, permanent farmsteads. She's trying to place people until she can move them on. And so that's a different, I think, approach than what the Woodstock Manual Training School is doing. And again, Prior Foster wasn't around either much. He has a very checkered and colored past with that. And the Fosters were so surprising to me that I don't have time to go into what I learned about the Fosters. But it shows me that despite them, people stayed, that they were willing to put down roots, just like the Claibornes and the Griggs. I mean, the widow is still owning that into the 1870s and 80s. And I did follow some of these people through, but it got to be so huge at that point that I'm never going to get to Jackson County if I go through and do this. I think the intriguing part of doing this, to me anyway, and what I found the fun of doing it, was taking that census data and creating the story just based on a few facts that shined up in the census, and giving people names and giving them agency within the place where they were located, and the fact that they wanted their children, because this fits so well. It's like reverse history. It's like we've done so long the big narrative of the Underground Railroad that we haven't gone back and said, well, this is the raw data that we use to get to that narrative. We just take that small narrative for granted and say, yeah, it was this and this. But this is the data that proves the paths of that the people took to get to Michigan, the length of time that it took to get to Michigan, the ages that people were at. I mean, this is the raw data, and we're actually giving more names to the story this way than the select highlighted stories that we talk about often. So I think this is an opportunity to go back and maybe check that bigger narrative that we've been espousing for so long and say, okay, is that really what's happening here? Or yes, it is what's happening here, and here's the proof of that. So I think it could go two ways with that. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. I say yeah because I don't know your name, and we're all wearing masks.
Thank you, Sherry. That concept of looking at a space where we don't see a name or we don't see people. So Chris Matthews, last year, maybe year before, wrote a book about civil rights in, I think it was Harlem, upstate New York, but that really talking about the concept of counter maps. So mapping what you can't see.
Yeah.
And then, so we look at the plat maps and we see, wow, look at all these large landholding white people, right? And then we start looking at the names and we see, wow, look at all these black folks that aren't landholding, right? And we know the significance of landholding, right?
Yes.
I still think about the Saunders settlement and all those folks over in Cass County that ended up with I'm looking at Maurice, that ended up with the deeds. We see them with the deeds shortly after them arriving in Cass County. But all of a sudden, as a visual tool, as a tool of advocacy, as a tool of being able to connect, as a curriculum opportunity, right? And now I'm looking at your boss as an opportunity to do story maps. But all of a sudden, black folks show up on a rural landscape, right? And not just one, not just two, but a bunch of folks. So when we look at these maps through the filter of land ownership, through money, right?
Yes.
We're going to see these large land-holding white folks, and then when we start to see the reality of what's going on, the population of so counter maps, this awesome opportunity to look at visually at that narrative that you're talking about. Yeah. And that's not going to happen until we actually start doing it ourselves. So.
Yeah, that's right. And going back to Walker Tavern and expanding the narrative there, we so long had siloed Walker Tavern as the quintessential Yankee establishment of Michigan history. And now we're trying to crack the nut of that area is hugely complex. Native Americans are still living there. The map that I showed earlier that I pointed out, the River Raisin, our staff artist is starting to collate that. He's put the Hinsdale Native American map on top of the Raisin River watershed. And what I'm such a I'm such a quill pen person. If I could reach out and just have a printed map of this whole thing, I would hand color in every place that African Americans were. But I don't have the technology to go and like he does and say, here's the River Raisin. Here's the white settlement pattern along the river. Here's how Native Americans used the river. And here are the black farmsteads and urban dwellings along the river. And so, if I could color that in, I'd be a lot more animated than I am now. But I can't. I don't. And until we find somebody that can do that, that's what we're struggling with in trying to upgrade the exhibits there at Walker Tavern is I want to take a map and just color it in. But I got to find me somebody that knows how to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, yes. I think you should perhaps consider two things. Number one, the census taker doesn't ask people, are you African American? Usually they just look at you
Yes.
and they mark it.
Yes.
So those African Americans who are light enough to be able to be mistaken for white people.
Yes.
And they're not going to correct them and say, oh, you know I'm black.
Yes,
You know.
no, that's
So
right.
I would suggest that there were probably several people who were not asked if they were African American. They were just assumed to be white.
Yes.
The
It's
second
true.
thing to consider is that when African Americans don't want to be found, you will not find them.
Yes.
And even today, dealing with the census in Detroit, there are a lot of black people who do not want to be counted.
Yes.
For whatever reason.
And I was surprised at how many in this two particular censuses did, considering the conditions on the ground at the time. And yes, for the narrative of this presentation, I called everybody an African American, but there were mulattoes, and there were blacks, and there were 50-50 pretty much. And yes, the census taker looked at them and said, how white is this person?
Right.
And sometimes you'd have a black and a mulatto parent, and the children are not named. And when there's no letter, they're assumed to be white. So, yes, censuses are flawed, definitely. The names, the spellings, the pronunciations, the locations, the denial. They'd say, where are you from? Unknown. The children were born in Illinois. Unknown. Parents were, and then in 1870 and 80, they would start confessing. So that by 1880, some of these same folks now are saying, I was born in Virginia. Back in 1850, they didn't dare say that. So here's the progression. So the census is flawed, but it gives us a better picture if we can compare it to the plat maps than we've ever had before.
Yeah, and then the other thing to be considered is that, what was the third thing? I was just thinking, it just went out of my head, so never mind.
Oh, well, you jump up if you think of it. Really, really, jump up and think of it. Anybody else? Yes.
I know for this you use primarily census data and plat maps. Have you used or have you thought about using township records of any kind at all?
Well, the map goes down to the township level, and if you can
Yeah.
find a name on a township section, you can pretty much, especially with whites, of course, go back to the biographical sketch and compare, going back and forth. So there are ways. I didn't have access sitting in my lazy boy of going to the township hall and saying, where's the deed, or the county courthouse and where's the deed. I was just trying to answer the question, are there African Americans living in plain sight in Lenawee County, or is the tradition that I was taught they were just passing through?
Yeah, township records are a lot of not
Yes.
digitized a lot of times.
Right,
Yeah.
No, if this was different times, I probably would have had a lot more resources to work with, but if it was different times, I'd have probably been on the road and I wouldn't have had the luxury of doing this. So I think it's been valuable. It's opened my eyes to what's more about the history of Lenawee County. It's painted a broader picture for me, and how we get that into the exhibit with my quill and pen abilities, don't know. That's for the young lady right there in the mask back there, our exhibit's curator, to figure out. So, yes, sir.
Have you ever looked at the occupation of the census takers? I know in Cass County, the few that I've looked at were teachers of the one-room schoolhouse. Now, I don't know if all the census takers were teachers.
I don't know that. I have not looked into that. That's interesting. I don't know. And that's another bias. You know, they say history shouldn't be biased, but we all have our biases. We walk around, mine's Lenawee County, but we all have our biases, and we all see it through a different lens. So yeah, those who the census taker was, yeah. If you knew that you had African Americans living in your section and you didn't want them to be known, would you find them out? I don't know. I'm just amazed at the number of people that did record themselves in these two censuses. I really am. And I'm sure they're there in the 1840s. We just don't know it because we got to sit there and look at tick marks. And tick marks doesn't really tell us anything except that a human lived here. Doesn't tell us a person, personality, skills, educational background, their assets. Doesn't tell us much in 1840 other than that there's people. Yes, they would know. Yes, they would. They're living in plain sight. Yes, they are, whether they want to admit it or not. Yep. All right. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a lot.